Okay, here we go. We're going to talk about, in Chapter 2, we're going to talk about variables in Java. These are very, very important, and this is going to be something we're going to be working with the entire time. So, first of all, variables are, a variable is a named memory location. So somewhere in the computer, at some point, we're going to do what we call declaring a variable, and we're going to establish a memory location right here in the computer. And it's going to be named. So in this case, we're going to name this memory location a H. And so you have a memory location that's reserved for this variable called age. It can store a value. For instance, this value could be 12. And then it can hold one value at a time. So it can only hold the 12 right now. It can't hold a 12 and a 15 at the same time. But the value can change during the program. So later on, we could change the 12, make it a 15. Okay, variables. The characteristics of a variable. Well, first of all, remember a variable is a memory location, which that's what this is right here. This is a memory location. And what are the characteristics of a memory location here for a variable? Well, it has a data type is one of its characteristics. The data type tells what type of value it can hold. For example, is it going to hold a literal string, a string of characters? Is it going to hold an integer? Or maybe it'll hold a decimal. Well, the data type determines that. You could probably guess what an int is going to store, and of course, an integer. So it'll store numbers like 5, 12, 13, but it's not going to store something like 6.2. And it's not going to hold something like fluffy. Okay, so it's just not going to work. All right, so the second characteristic of a variable is its identifier, or its name. So we've already done this. It's age, we're in this case. And that's the identifier, and just like we identified or named classes, now we're going to identify or name variables. Its value is the third part of a variable. In this case, we're going to call it 12. All right, well, just digress for a second. We're going to talk about different data types. A data type determines three things about a value of a variable. This is very important. When you set something, a variable up to be a certain data type, that's going to restrict three different elements about it. So first of all, the data type will determine the type of data that can be stored. So if we establish a variable to be an int data type, we are restricting the type of data that can be stored in it to just integers, like we said before, like 12 or 15 or 32. It means that we cannot store things like a pet's name or a person's name or a type of sport. It can't store decimals. It'll also restrict how much or determine how much memory the variable memory location occupies. So some memory locations are going to take up more memory in the computer than others. And so the type of data type is going to determine how much memory that memory location takes up. And then thirdly, it's going to restrict what kind of operations can be performed on the data, or in other words, the variable's value. So obviously, if it's an int, it can be added, multiplied, things like that. If it's a name of a person, well, you can't multiply or add it and different things like that. So it's going to determine the operations that can be done with it. So there's different types of data types. So we're going to take a look at some primitive data types. A primitive data type is basically just a simple data type. Basic, the most basic data type there is. So there are some integer types, types that hold integers only. Well, one is called a byte. That's an integer type, and it's an integer that occupies only 1 byte. So if you remember, we talked about binary numbers, and so a byte would have 8 bits. So here's a binary number right here. So right there, that would be a byte right there. So this means numbers from negative 128 to 127. Those numbers, so if you can't store the number 130 in a byte variable, it's got to be between negative 128 and 127. A short is another integer type, and that is longer than a byte, and you can see there that it contains from negative 32,000 to positive 32,000. Then it have an int. Now it's in red because this is a type that we're going to use. We're not going to really be using a byte and a short in our programs, but we are going to use ints, no matter how small or big they are. So an integer, of course, is longer than a short. It goes from negative 2 billion to approximately to 2 billion. And then a long is even another integer type. We're not going to use this one, but this one is from approximately negative 9 quintillion to 9 quintillion, and that is a quintillion has 18 zeros in it. Okay, then you have decimal types. Now this decimal types are called floating point numbers. Floating point numbers are decimal types. So if you hear that term floating point, we're really talking about decimals. Well, one is called a float data type, and this is the least precise decimal type there is. So it does not have the same precision as the other data type that, or decimal type that we're going to bring up, and we might talk about this later on. Double is the other floating point decimal type, data type, and it's more precise than the float, and it also occupies more memory than a float. We're going to use doubles for all of our decimals, where we could use floats at times, but we're just going to use a double for all decimals in our programs. Other primitive types would be char, which is just a single character, and Boolean, which is a value that can only be, values that can only be true or false, lowercase true or lowercase false. So the Boolean variable cannot be a 6 or a 12 or Fluffy or Jim or 12.6. Its value is true or its value is false, lowercase. Reference data types is another type, which really we're not supposed to cover until Chapter 7, but we're going to use them now. And the main reference data type we're going to use is a string. This will be very commonly used. This refers to another memory location that holds a string of characters. And that's not going to make any sense to you at all, and we are going to talk about this at some other time. We'll illustrate this. The bottom line is that this string, a string, for our purposes, is going to hold a literal string or a string of characters. So it's going to be reserved for things like the name of a company, or the name of a sport, or some kind of words. It could be a phrase, things like that. So string is what we're going to use as well. Now, variables, back to variables. Let's go back here. Variables are declared, they are assigned, and they are called. And we're going to get really familiar with this. So tonight we're just touching base with this really quickly. So first of all, variables are declared a certain data type. So it's going to be declared either to be an int, a double, or a string. It's going to be assigned a value based on that data type, and it's going to be called to, it's going to be requested the use of its value. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at an example of a declaration, an assignment, and a calling of a variable in JGrasp. And again, this will be just a quick example, and then tomorrow's class, or the next class we have, we'll get into this more extensively. So here we are. Here's JGrasp. The name of this program is called Meet Bobby. It shows how a variable is declared, assigned, and called. This class prints a boy's name and age. That's the purpose of it. And so as you look at this, you can see that we have this all taking place in the main method. And so we have our declarations right here. And this is what a declaration looks like. It's got the data type, the identifier, and a semicolon. Data type, identifier, semicolon. And then it's going to be assigned. So boy one name here is going to be assigned the name Bobby, or the value Bobby. Boy one age is going to be assigned the value 12. So that's what's happening here. The variables will be called. So in here in this print statement, you notice that we have some familiar literal strings, but the unfamiliar, well, what's this? It doesn't have quotation marks. That's because this is the identifier, or the name of a variable. It's going to call that variable and ask to use its value. So it's going to want to use the value of Bobby. And then this one here is going to call boy one age and ask, can I use your value? And it's going to be using the value 12. So this should say Bobby is 12 years old. And so here we'll compile it. Looks good. And now we run it. So here it is. Bobby is 12 years old. And that's an example of a variable being declared, assigned, and called. And that's it.